Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Alex Schlechter, and I'm the program manager at Baxter St, and I am very excited to provide the introduction to this conversation between artist Cheryl Mukherjee and curator and director of sepiaEye, Esa Epstein, discussing Cheryl's solo exhibition, Wanted Beautiful Home Loving Girl. In Wanted Beautiful Home Loving Girl, Mukherjee leans into and reimagines the tradition of Indian matrimonial portraiture as a meditation on prescribed femininity. The exhibition examines how memory, transgenerational trauma, and personal and collective history informs identity. Today is the last day to see Mukherjee's solo exhibition at Baxter St, so please stop by before 6 p.m. This conversation will last approximately 1 hour with the opportunity for a brief Q&A portion at the end. We highly encourage you to use the Q&A feature to post questions throughout today's conversation. Cheryl Mukherjee is a visual artist and writer currently living and working in Brooklyn, New York. She graduated with an MFA in Advanced Photographic Studies from the International Center of Photography, Bard College, New York in 2020. In her current work, Cheryl explores the idea of origin and inheritance, which is embedded in the figure of her mother and her presence in the family album. It deals with memory, personal history, transgenerational trauma, and how they inform identity. Cheryl primarily works with photography, text, and video. Esa Epstein is an archivist, curator, and director of sepiaEye Gallery. The gallery is dedicated to showing a spectrum of modern and contemporary photography and video work from Asia. As a curator, many of her exhibitions have been mounted in museums and galleries internationally and have been reviewed in numerous publications, most notably the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Sun, Art News, and Art in America. sepiaEye artists have gained critical acclaim and international recognition, and their works are included in major European and US museum collections and private collections. In her former role as the executive director of Sepia International and the Al-Kazi collection, Epstein helped build an impressive collection of Indian photography and photographic history. She continues to offer her expertise in this area to advise both private and public collection acquisitions. Thank you everyone again for tuning in, and I will now hand it over to Cheryl and Esa.
Hi everybody, welcome to the talk. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to start with sharing a bit about the work, about the show, and how it came to be, I guess. So just for people who don't know, this work was made as part of the Workspace Residency program at Baxter St Camera Club of New York, where I was an artist in resident for 3 months, and the work that I made through the residency culminated in this show, which is called Wanted Beautiful Home Loving Girl. This work is about matrimonial photographs, matrimony, and it focuses on just the tradition and the studio of taking matrimonial photographs brides in India. A matrimonial photograph is specifically a photograph with the purpose of using it for an arranged marriage. It is used in a photo studio, and it acts as an aid in this arranged marriage market and system in India, where it is also accompanied by a horoscope and a biodata and other small information about families that are exchanging this matrimonial photograph. I started this work because I was looking through my mother's matrimonial photographs. They exist in my family albums, not curated together, but they are just strewn around. And I started this work by putting together these matrimonial photographs and just looking at the sub-archive of my mother's matrimonial photos, which were made from the ages of 21 to 26. 26 was the age where her final matrimonial photograph was picked up and selected for an arranged marriage. While looking through these matrimonial photographs and photographs of my mother in general through family albums, I have found a resemblance between my looks and hers. I look like my mother. And this work started as a meditation on what it meant to look like my mother. Does that mean that I would become like her? What about photography, or what about seeing or looking like something constitutes becoming like them? And I think became very obsessed with that. And while looking through the matrimonial photos, I really asked myself whether this was something that was for myself, or this was something, a rite of passage, that if my grandmother gone the whole market, would that mean that it was my thing also to do? Well, this was the photograph that was selected by my father, and I remember him jokingly talking about the fact that, oh, the photograph was great and everything, but you couldn't tell a person's height from the photograph. And that was the problem, I think, about photography, that you could not capture. Another problem that I encountered, or like a dissonance, is how I studied about photography in grad school, where I studied a lot of essays by Roland Barthes and other thinkers around photography, who were very obsessed with the idea of a photograph showing, and a portrait being a good portrait if it shows the essence of a person. And matrimonial photography, or photography in India, studio photography in India, was not about finding the essence of a person, but through studio photography, or through the liminal space of the studio, photography became about projecting an idea onto a person. And in that case, matrimonial photography was this projection of what an ideal female or an ideal bride would look like in an arranged marriage system. I started recreating my own matrimonial photographs in this work. This is a hand-painted matrimonial photograph of my grandmother. I'm not sure actually when this was taken. It has no information behind or on it, but hand-painting photographs, I think, is something we will talk about. Was the tradition in India where you commission an artist, work with an artist to paint over a black and white photograph, to bring out the details, to make it richer, or to give certain just thought about and that tradition, and try to replicate that in my grandmother's image, because it's one of the very few images of my grandmother in my album. And I just wanted to mimic this tradition of framing it in a very elaborate frame, which is not, which looks always odd on the wall, but it's a memorial photograph. And then this work shifted to a point, and actually started with a point where I started re-entering the family album, where I was imagining what my images or my matrimonial images would look like. And I started recreating images of myself alongside prints of my mother's images. So if you can see, this is the print of my mother. And I started making these images in my living room or in my studio space. I was also thinking about a lot about, while making this work, I was also thinking about the studio space and how it acts as a space where somebody can play and perform and aspire to take on identities that they find desirable, or something that they want to play with. And I think this work allowed me a space where I was meditating on my family archives and stuff, but also playing and performing the idea of what it meant to be desirable, or what desire really ultimately meant. And a lot of these matrimonial photos were usually taken in domestic spaces. So I was making these photographs in my apartment. This one is called I Want a Home, which is in my kitchen. Another backdrop. And through this work, I started also exploring the difference and the different backdrops that people were using in photo studios. Entire tradition of hand painting studio backdrops, where people would stand against hand painted backdrops. The point of these backdrops was that not that they had to be very professionally done or had to be perfectly seamless, but that it just was an amateurish thing that denoted that you aspired to pose against it, or some connection where you chose that, oh, this is something that I want to associate with. Props also acted in photo studios as this these objects that meant or were symbolic to your desires or aspirations. Men would usually pose with guns and bikes and, cars and stuff like that. And women would pose with flowers and books and, jewelry and other things. And I just started thinking about those things and that idea. A lot of this work was also about thinking about how I understand and I have come to understand desirability. If I do find myself desirable against like the standards of desirability, I guess, out there. And I also, at some point in the work, I also started thinking about the matrimonial photograph and how it in today's dating system and dating market. As someone who has had a fair share of dating out there and using dating apps, I thought the matrimonial thirst traps on the dating app, where it was still through a photograph, a person trying to convey that they wanted to be picked, that they wanted to be chosen, and they were desirable on the internet. There were filters here, and there were short exchanges, and it was mostly the photograph was the opening point of the conversation. And I thought that was very interesting because the matrimonial photograph and the dating app, they both rely on this idea that you are letting someone else do the desiring for you, where it's a traditional matchmaker in an arranged marriage, but it's an algorithm on a dating app.
But it's also like, and I'm sorry to interrupt, we have plenty of time to talk, but it's also like advertising.
Yeah, it is.
And you're advertising yourself.
Yeah.
So you want to put yourself out in the best way. You want to show that you're from a good family, or you have certain political beliefs or religious beliefs.
Right. And it was, I think, like how in studios you would use props to denote these things as symbols. Like, as if somebody was an educated person and wanted to come across as that in a studio portrait, they would pose with a lot of books, or they would pose with globes or something like that to just denote the same thing. But on dating apps, it's also the same thing, where you have the prompts, where you're advertising yourself, the fact that your bio only allows a certain number of characters, and how much that resembles a matrimonial advertisement. A matrimonial advertisement was one where people would publish in national daily newspapers that they were looking for and seeking out grooms and brides, and they would describe what they wanted their bride or groom to be like. And sometimes for brides, the only qualifier would be wanted, beautiful, home-loving girl, which is what the show is named after, as if it was the only qualifier that one needed to be an eligible bride, I guess. A lot of this work, I mean, I can always make a pseudo-intellectual argument about what this work means and what are these things, but a lot of this work allowed me to just play in the studio, where I would wake up and be like, okay, what do I feel like being? I want to put on a face, I want to cry through it, I want to wear a lipstick, but I want it not to be perfect. So just understanding what I in that moment found desirable and what I wanted to present as and perform as in the studio space that was in my apartment. It was like
but you're taking agency. You're saying, this is what I'm gonna I'm gonna put out there, not what I'm supposed to put out there.
Right.
Plus there's a whole space which we can talk about a little later about creativity and play and performance that we can see in a lot of your work.
I think I was thinking about those things too, the agency, that how in traditional matrimonial photographs, you would have someone direct you, a professional photographer tell you that you have to pose like this, and like these are the props we have and everything. But it's weird when you are the professional photographer and the person.
Well, I loved the fact that your mother, who was in med school, studying to be a surgeon, the person who took her photographs was a medical photographer.
Yeah, and it was like I think the first matrimonial photograph that was taken of my mother is of her wearing a brown sari, but it's an out of focus photograph. And so when I look at it now, I'm like, of course you didn't get selected for marriage because it was an out of focus photograph. But it was this act that her photographer was this professional photographer in her medical college who was tasked with the work of photographing cadavers and medical specimens and stuff. But it did not matter what kind of a professional photographer they were. It mattered that they carried a camera and they knew that they were ultimately taking matrimonial photographs. And it was not like, yeah, of course I can take it, sort of a thing. But yeah, I think it was important that I was creating my own matrimonial photograph because it made me confront my own ideas of what I thought beauty was, or my own prejudices against how I wanted to come across and what I wanted to seem like. I think it's John Berger who talks about this idea of internalizing the male gaze, like women internalizing the male gaze, that there is a viewer in our head and there's a person who's being viewed as women, and the person who's a viewer is always a man in your head. And when I was making these photos, sure, I'm not wearing clothes in some of these photos, but I still wanted to come across as hot. I still wanted to come across as like, oh yeah, that's like a rebellious photo, but she's still hot. And there were these confrontations that I was constantly making, like, oh, that's really messed up that I think that I want to come across as this, because I am playing into the same ideas of what is beautiful, what is desirable, what is sexy. And it's a lot of existential crisis, confronting your body image issues.
Well, it's also, I find very interesting that it's the same time period as your mother.
Right.
And so you're talking about, your 20s, where you're becoming your own person, and, there's agendas. There's an agenda study your mom had with medical school, you with your skills and undergrad, but you're still at that same time projecting, kind of advertising, this is who I am, to attract the right connection.
And I think about that in terms of like the learnings we have through generations. Like, I am reading different books than my mother did. Because I'm living on the internet, because I'm more there's an idea of what how woke I am as a feminist, and like, or I'm doing my work of reading all these books, like, I'm reading all the perfect books, and I'm like training my mind to think out of the box and like break away from these expectations of what beauty are. But it still feels like an unsaid inheritance that I have to go through this practice because my mother did, as a reverence almost, but also as, I don't know, like, how far can you go?
Well, I think it's also interesting that you're here.
Right.
You're not doing this in India. You're doing it in a place where you have a lot more freedom, and you're also we're in art school.
Right.
You're an artist, you're experimenting, you're looking at other influences around you and people who are using nudity or kind of uncovering themselves in a way that you might not be able to do that there.
I mean, it's definitely been a learning curve, and I do understand that it requires a lot of privilege to be able to put your body out there and be like, this is it, and you either like it or you don't. I think it's funny, but also probably the bravest thing I've done to have my first solo show and it be just about my thirst traps, or it be about my body. Somebody walked in like one of the first days that the show opened, and they came in, did not say a word, took a photograph of one of the frames and left. And I was like, okay, so my photograph is just going to exist on your phone like that, which is in a lot of ways very empowering, but in a lot of ways is very alienating, because I do not see my body in a fictional way. Like, even though I'm making narratives out of it, even though I'm making work out of it, I still am living in this body, however,
but you also have to let it go.
So which sometimes gets tricky, because how much are you letting it go, and just realizing that you don't have control of how people take your work, and then ultimately how they take your body.
which is ultimately about letting go of some sort of control.
Well, you control the frame, you control every aspect of actually taking the photograph,
Right.
from the setup to pushing pushing the shutter. So I think that you have the power kind of behind the camera, but it's true, when people come to see your work, they bring their own world to it. And so their interaction, and they might not know the background that you come from, or the background that you carry when you do this work.
Right.
So Cheryl and I can talk for hours. So
Which is
did you go through the rest of the?
I just was going to go through the other slides, the other photographs that I made. This one's called Still Life, where I am basically just talking about props that were used and in studios, where I'm talking also about layering of backdrops and just playing in the photo studios, thinking about how the studio lends itself as a space and how I can just mess with that a bit. This is the hand-painted backdrop. I think I'm not a painter, but I think the point of painting this backdrop was that it had to be bad, which is what this backdrop is. It's also me thinking about how backdrops were this place where you could pose against it like it would denote some sort of aspiration, like, you know, people who did not have access to places like the Taj Mahal or hadn't gone on a family trip to Taj Mahal, they would go to the studio and pose against it. I was thinking about New York because I was here. I did a pretty bad job making the skyline on this backdrop, but I was thinking about domesticity. I think I've become a very domestic person over the last year. So I think I painted the backdrops keeping those things.
But it's interesting, and I'm glad that you're going, you can proceed, because that's actually what I was going to say is, both with this piece, which is behind us here, you do have a found photograph,
Right.
As well as with this one,
Right.
which is a painted backdrop, but it has the drop-in of the black and white image of your grandmother.
Yes.
That you've then painted over here.
Right.
So you're kind of going, you're throttling, you're going back and forth between 19th century and present day.
Yeah, I think these found photographs, I found them in like a thrift store back in India. And I think they spoke to the same tradition of like, not matter whether these women were from my family or not, they still had these portraits taken, they still posed against hand-painted backdrops and objects. So it became like, I don't know, like I think a collective experience of just multiple like women through generations being a subject.
But during a very specific period in their life.
Right.
This is something you mentioned specifically when you're talking about the album, is the photographs of your mother that are part of your own archive, family archive, are mostly when she was being photographed for wedding photographs, right?
And I think this is something that I hadn't noticed until now. Like the photographs, even pre-independent India, the photographs that were made by the British of women in studios or in courts and stuff like that were women of a certain age. And they were made, postcards were made for a specific voyeuristic purpose. I don't think I have seen, the nutgirls, and I don't think I have seen older women or women, like it was always this certain category and the age category.
Women of position.
Yeah.
But that has something to do with photography too, because photography was available to the wealthier classes at the beginning, and so we have the Maharajas and their families and such. But I think that it's nice to kind of have both within the same image because it draws on that. But then again, today you make it your own.
Right. I think about these photographs as footnotes in the show, where I did not reflect while making this work or while researching this work. I did not have an archive, like I could not just go to a museum and be like, oh, I want to see matrimonial photographs or studio photographs specifically of women of marriageable age in India. It is an archive that exists in homes, it exists in thrift stores, in families, and then how do people have access to them? You just knock on doors and be like, hey, can I look at your wedding photograph or something like that? But I think the fact that I found these photographs from somebody else's album was also like, you're one of us.
Yes, yes.
These are screen prints that are physical screen prints that exist in the gallery space that I made from matrimonial advertisements. This is a print of a page from the classified matrimonial advertisements from the newspaper in India. I think the date is sometime in 1990, but they are still very much putting these out, and they are still reaching out and seeking marriages and arranged marriages through the newspaper format. And I think there are 100 of these in the gallery space. And this was something that I made just thinking about this reproduction and this uncontrollable reproduction of advertisements, seeking something, asking for something, looking for something that does not end, something so personal, like, oh, you're supposed to find someone to spend the rest of your life with, but here's a very public way of doing it through the form of a newspaper. I think the newspaper was the first way people would put it out, and then the photographs were exchanged. Some of these newspaper advertisements would be, almost all of them had caste mentioned, anything that denoted wealth, that denoted education, like wanted beautiful girl for a wealthy, abroad educated man, never divorced, a high caste background.
Similar.
Or similar,
Yeah, I think that there's lots of cultures. I know that in arranged marriage, it's someone like your family, like a match because of family, religion, class, caste.
Often actually these ads were like, arranged marriages were also a way, I think, for having an upward social mobility for a lot of people who did not have the caste privilege in India. For like, if somebody is a more educated person, or if somebody is a more good-looking person, that would be like, I don't want to say trope because it sounds suspicious, but it would be a thing that would be like, oh, I have a much educated son, but from a lower caste, and I can use that education to set her up with a girl from a higher caste. And that became a way for people to make relations and have business coalitions in the name of marriage and stuff. I think, and I don't think it's alliances, and I don't think it's specific to India. I think everybody does that, even in New York, I think. This actually are these set of matchboxes, and we're getting close to the end of the presentation, but these matchboxes was something that I was thinking about on the same lines as the newspapers, where there's this uncontrollable reproduction of not just advertisements, but other cultural ephemera in the marriage market, where you would perpetuate the same ideas of seeing women in their social roles, and like seeing women as brides, and using something as simple as a canvas of a matchbox, something which is available to all classes in society in India, to perpetuate this idea that, okay, a woman is a bride.
And also a commodity.
Right?
I mean, I love them because as we don't see these as much in America, this is a very common thing in India, the matchbox. And so I love how you went through and inserted yourself into some of them. And I love the installation of the multiples of just a whole wall of these, because you also play it on scale, just like with the newsprint. Of just every day you have these people out there saying, pick me, pick me, pick me, right?
But also this was I mean, I'm not just saying that people specifically make matchboxes, but this was another canvas for me to play with. Like, I'm very interested in the idea of looking at photographs in a social way, and the matrimonial photograph becomes a currency. It becomes a social currency that is exchanged, handled, transferred, and stuff like that. Same with these other cultural ephemera that have photographs on it, and how the photograph travels in such a social market. That I think something is, yeah, that is very interesting to me.
Well, it's also this idea, and I don't know where I read it, but where it's almost like a portfolio, and we've talked about it before with Tomoka Sawada's work, Amayo, which is about kind of a dossier almost of photographs of this is me and all my different guises. And then it's reviewed just like a business plan.
Right.
And then it's returned.
Right.
If there's no interest.
Exactly. And it is actually considered disrespectful if you don't return the photograph. My father, again, I think I remember him telling me about this when I was asking questions like, how was his experience going through the system? And he said, I think somebody should be there to do this thing for you. Already hinting at the fact that this is not an individual endeavor. Families are involved.
Absolutely.
Like families are involved in sending the photographs, maintaining conversation. But that was not the case in my father's case. So he forgot to return one of the photographs that he had from a potential bride. And he tells me that a month later, a month after sending that photograph, the father of the woman sent a very harsh, almost like disrespectful letter to my father, being like, how dare you keep the photograph? That is disrespectful. You're a bad man and stuff like that. So I think it had to be returned, which is not the case anymore with thirst traps, because it's circulating on the internet. There are screenshots. The fact that your image is out there, it's out there. There is no point of return.
Right.
Even a point of return is another transaction in a lot of ways.
But you know what I find so interesting when we talk about thirst traps is it's like the painted photograph, and you touched on this a little bit, but so you start out with a black and white photograph. When you paint it, and a lot of studios in the 19th century had a photographer and then they had a painter.
Right.
And often the painter was the one that signed their name. And I'm not sure if it was all from miniature painting, but things were adorned.
Right.
And you could go in as a peasant,
Right.
and you can stand in front of a painted backdrop which showed a very ornate room with, you know, very ornate carpets. And then when it was painted, your silver jewelry became gold, and your shawls became beautiful Kashmiri shawls, and you were adorned to show the public a different you, right? A more enhanced you, a more embellished you, which is also part of like fantasy and kind of putting yourself out there in a different way than how you are.
Exactly.
But that was also done by somebody else, not necessarily you, but it still plays on that idea of fantasy.
Of fantasy, and that you could be whoever you want to be. It's just about choosing which is something that I think is one of the most exciting qualities of photography. I think, we have spent so much time thinking about like, how can we just photograph what's true? I think a lot of question about power and truth in photography, and photography as a journalistic documentary tool. It brings out these questions of what is the truth and what is photography's role in documenting today's truth. But to me personally, one of the more exciting aspects of photography is this fantasy land, or this play and this performance that you can enter while just occupying a liminal space that is not too private and not absolutely public, because existing as a woman in a public space in India is also jarring. So
we've spoken about it before, but you know, when you got involved in photography in India, you also started out with documentary. Right, that was your exposure.
Yes.
And then when you came here to go to graduate school, how was that different in terms of what you were seeing, reading, being exposed to? How did that change your view of photography and being an artist?
I'm going to stop sharing and then answer that question. Because I think we've gone through the, we can do the speaker. Okay. I think when we were, I think back in India, like you said, my introduction to photography was through a very documentary lens. I was like out there on the street every evening, probably like street photographing, getting the frames and getting, like being the voyeuristic photographer who's not seen, who's not noticed. But there was a limitation in that, because how are you not seen as a woman in India, period? You could guise yourself as anybody, you could want to be anybody, but you are always under scrutiny, and especially with a camera out in India, photographing and being the voyeuristic photographer. And for me, that was very limiting, because I was dealing with the same questions of, oh, am I really wanting to do this? Is this my story? But also with hyper visibility. It was not even something but it changed in New York, because through the grad program that I got, the structure of the program was such that it allowed for a lot of longer projects. It allowed for a lot of reading. It allowed for a lot of studio time. And I had never had a studio practice to sit with my thoughts and ideas. And I thought the work that I was seeing, the women photographers that I was seeing here, not just American photographers, but like the photographers from the Indian diaspora that I was seeing here were making such different work, but also I had noticed that there were other drawbacks to that, because when you are making work from a country like India, there's always a chance that you are going to get tokenized, and you are then constantly stuck in a loop of making work about your identity, like your South Asianness, that I come from South Asia, and a place like New York, I will exist as an artist who's constantly explaining to people what her South Asianness is about, which is something, it's tempting to fall into that trap, because you're going to get a gallery show. If you talk about how traumatic it is to grow up in India as a woman and stuff, I think. But these are tropes, I think, that are easier to fall into. And I'm not saying that I don't talk about my South Asianness. I think this work is about that. But it is also so much about speaking from a place of South Asianness than speaking of my South Asianness.
Well, it's who you are.
Yeah.
Right, and you're coming from that starting point. And in
Right.
fact, that was one question that I wanted to ask you, which I talked to you about before, is you come from a Bengali Hindu, very traditional family. You're the eldest one, and your name is Cheryl. So that was the first thing that I asked you about, was why is your name Cheryl?
Yeah. And the answer to that is because, the funny answer to that is that my dad has a colonial hangover. But the more serious answer to that is that my father actually believed that me having an anglicized name would make it easier for people in a foreign country to address me, to talk to me, and not waste time learning how to pronounce my very traditional name. Everybody in my family has a traditional name. But I remember when I got my visa for New York to come here for grad school, my dad went with me. And when I got it approved, he was like, I knew you were always an export quality material. So, but but that is also, it also speaks to the same idea as your proximity to something that is so Western, that is something which is desirable, because what is out there in the West, the Western beauty standards and everything are so desirable that I think women and from India, and I cannot speak on everybody's behalf, but from my experience, the women in my lives have spent a lot of time trying to be proximal or be associated to that Western standard of beauty. And that's just one, that is frustrating, and two, it's just a lot of wasted time.
Well, it actually comes up in your work. I want to talk about your beginnings in India in terms of your education, because I think that actually is the foundation for your work. But we're going to go back to that because I want to talk about the face mask,
Right.
which talks very much about what you mentioned about your skin tone.
Right.
And when I first saw them, I thought mask. Just like the masks that we see in other artists recently, Gore's show, James Cohen and Phyllis Colombo's work on masks from Mexico. So it's something that is put
Right.
on top of you,
Right.
whether it's to shade what's underneath
Yeah.
or for you to promote something else.
Right.
So when I first asked you about the face mask, your response was not what I expected.
I mean, I was just having a self-care day practically, but they were, I mean, the mask photographs are photographs because I think women in my family, my mother, my sister, I, and like the friends I know, we've at some point all have gone through the experience of someone, usually women in their families, shaming them for the color of their skin. I've spent a lot of my childhood, not a lot of my childhood, but a considerable and an impressionable amount of my childhood, just wishing I was fairer, or wishing that if that was one thing, if I was fairer, I would be more desirable, and just going to lengths and to extents to make sure that happens. And like so much of that experience is just shapes you. You can be in New York and you can be like, suddenly I'm exotic and desirable, that's fine. But like, how do you undo like years and years of shame? Like,
because these were face masks that you had growing up to make your skin lighter.
Yeah, to make my skin lighter, and there are still things that are sold out in the market which would do that, and people use it, and and I'm not going to be the person to be like, you shouldn't do that, and that's wrong, and that's not feminism and stuff. Like, I am just saying that I understand, coming from that place, that how hard it is to tell yourself that, oh, this is not the standard of beauty I want to associate myself with, or this is not who I am. But how willing are you to put in the work to.
Well, it's also like, when you're growing up and your mother puts something on your face and you sit there and you don't ask questions about why, aren't I, good enough?
Right.
But it's in your head.
Right.
And so I find it interesting that your undergraduate focus with psychology, because that's something that comes up a lot in your work. And it really is the background to the way you're thinking.
Yeah. I think psychology really helped me. I studied psychology to start because my parents were like, we need you to have like a secure education before you jump into being an artist, which is in like an unsafe place to be in. But psychology actually helped me and shaped the way I looked at art. It shaped the way I want to think about art. It shaped the way I want to approach people, because my work is about a lot of people. So it was not really about like, oh, how do I unlock years and years of like trauma or something. It was basically about how can I learn to approach these things with basic empathy or an unconditional sort of positive regard, that I do not look at these archives or look at these practices from a lens of judgment, but from a lens of empathy or a lived experience, that I did that and I went through that, but it's not something that I can blame myself for in a lot of ways. I would take any opportunity to give away responsibility of my actions. I don't want to deal with the consequences of my actions.
Well, it's also, you bring out, in terms of experimentation, other ways besides photography of working, and there's nothing in this right now, but you've mentioned that you've taken embroidery, and there's painting, and there's printmaking, there's an album that you made. So they're also the kind of process of working.
Right. I think a lot about, I firstly think photography is very limiting in its practice. Like,
very quick and how it has become the process of quickly taking a photograph. And I get frustrated sometimes because when I'm working with certain ideas, I don't often see them in a photograph. I like to write, I like to embroider. A lot of my processes, I like them to mimic labor because it takes work to sit with something. I think that's something that I've been talking about, like, it takes work to undo something as much as it takes to do something. And when it comes to using labor intensive processes like screen printing or embroidery, something that I'm not fluent in at all, but I learn as I go, is because I'm interested in thinking about labor, domestic labor, not washing dishes or cleaning or anything, but the work it takes to stay related to someone, even if it is your own mother or your own grandparents, through this one thread that joins all of you at once. And yeah, I just really have been feeling empowered in my domesticity. So I'm like, bring out the embroidery, let's start cooking and stuff like that.
But it's also interesting to me, I mean, and when I first saw the work and I was really struck by your images of nudity, I asked you about your relationship with your mother, and you almost, to me, felt that it was collaborative.
Yeah, collaborative, not in a way that, she is artistically or process-wise involved, but she's a huge part of my work is research or just thinking about certain things and meditating on certain things. And that is where my mother is a huge collaborator, where a lot of these conversations that I'm having are like, Mom, I'm thinking about this thing, or I've picked up this book and I thought, and these are conversations I have with my mother for hours and hours, and a lot of this, she, I think, called me when I was still making this work, and she would call me and be like, I just imagined this frame where you photograph yourself like this and you pose against this and you did that.
She was getting involved.
She was getting involved and she was excited to be involved. Well, she was deciding when, I would expect my mother to tell me like, oh, you should sit properly and sit,
Right.
But she would be like, no, I want you to mess this up. I want you to sit a certain way, and I want you to look fierce, and I want you to do this. So it was interesting, this combination of an artistic collaborator versus a mother, which was constantly clashing, but it was fun, it was collaborative still. Like, my mother is probably still looking for an arranged marriage match for me, and she tells me that, you have to take a traditional photograph as a joke or something. But then when I'm making this work, she's out there, she's helping me, she's thinking with me, she's thinking like me, or like completely her own self. But I think that's what the most exciting part about this work is. It is about my relationship with my mother, but it is an active verb.
Right.
Like, I'm still living that relationship with my mother.
Yes, always. I want to ask you about the idea of the studio. I just want to check the time because it's almost 1 o'clock. So Alex, are there any questions before I ask another question?
We haven't had any questions from the audience, so please feel free to use the Q&A feature. But I have a couple questions that I can chime in later if we need.
Okay, I have just one question that I felt we touched on, but I wanted to get into, and then Alex, I'm going to hand it over to you for your question. I love the fact that the came from a residency, which is thanks to Baxter St, but also a space where you can work.
Right.
And even though you didn't use kind of the residency space here, hello, New York, you did use your own space.
Right.
And I just am interested in you talking about this space. You touched on it a little bit before of the studio,
right,
and what it means to you. And also, I think you had mentioned to me also this idea of this shiny print,
right,
when you get a wedding portrait. And I love that you're very interested in the object. So that those are two things: studio and I guess object or process.
right. I think I had completely, like speaking of space, I think I had completely turned my living room into this massive studio where everything was a prop, where everything could just be an extension of the photograph. And I wanted to also break away from the idea of what a studio frame was, like where there was the backdrop and you, what happened around it, what happened beyond it. I was interested in looking at that. I thought it was like, I feel incredibly lucky that I had this space to work within. And it just became like a playground where I could pull one thread from here and pull another thread from the other place, and I just sewed it all together. So I think a playground and a sandbox was an important space. But speaking of, what was the other?
Process and object.
Of objects. I think I am very
We had a
fascinated.
long talk about image versus object.
Right, right.
So that's what I'm touching on.
I think I'm very interested in the photograph as an object because in the matrimonial system and in the arranged marriage market, the matrimonial photo is transferred as an object.
Yes.
It loses its meaning as a fine art photograph. It loses its meaning as, oh, it's a photograph, or so it becomes an object, like a memory of a place where you went. It's like having a souvenir. And I think when people go to a photo studio, they often pay the whole price, and they would tell the photographer that I want a full length photo because I paid the full price,
Right.
right? And I want a brightly colored photograph because I paid the full price. And it makes sense, like more colors, more features if you're paying the full price. And I think that is not, as opposed to like a dreamy black and white fine arty photograph, because people here are not in, like when people are going and saying that, they're not interested in the photograph as art. They're interested in the photograph as an object that I went there, I paid something for it, and I got this in return. And I think because my introduction to the matrimonial photograph was through my mother's prints, I have a bit of a soft spot for that, where I am, like, even if I am photographing digitally and making the work digitally, I still have this other works that are objects, things you can touch. I love touching artworks. Like I have a record of like touching major artworks in big museums because I'm really, I mean, I can name drop, like, I've touched a Matisse, like, I've touched an Andy Warhol.
You might not want to say that, but
you don't know where I live yet. So, but I am interested in the idea of the object of this photograph that can be exchanged, that can be transferred, something that loses the aura of the fine art photograph, because that is not how I see photography at all. My introduction to photography has been through objects like the family album or the calendar. You know how you would have like old calendars that would have a specific photo, and that was and years would go by. Like I remember one of my aunts, she has a calendar that dates back to like 1995, but she still has it in her apartment because it has a photograph of a god on it.
I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about what the Baxter Street residency has kind of meant for you, if you have any advice for future residents or like experiences that have stood out. I think that might be a great question to kind of wrap up and jumping off of Esa's question about the studio space.
I think this was my first residency, and I have been very fortunate to have this space because it has been a very supportive space where it's not just like as an early career artist, not just monetarily, it has been a good support, but also in terms of community where I could always like text Jill or somebody else from the Baxter community, where I always had access to people who have been residents here to be like, hey, I'm doing this for the first time, can you help me? And yes, they would. And this whole unconditional idea of like, I will share resources because I understand how difficult it is to do this for the first time. That is something that I have truly, genuinely felt at Baxter Street, and their support in terms of just entertaining ideas. I could walk in and be like, I want to paint this wall black, and they'd be like, yeah,
we'll do it.
Well, I think also during COVID, we've spent so much time on our own. And I think as artists, you spend a lot of time on your own as well. And so to have a community and have people that you can kind of lean on and get support. I mean, just the fact that I can talk to you like this without a face mask is such a blessing. And I think we all miss it. So I'm glad you had the opportunity.
Yeah, and like despite the distance, there was still like despite it being virtual, there was still a sense of community at Baxter when I was making this work. And it felt like it was culminating into this show, which was very, very rewarding. It was a good, humbling, rewarding feeling.
It's also a destination. I think a lot of times when we're working on creative things, if there isn't a deadline or something that, you know, we have to stop and get it out there. And this was like a process.
Right. Yeah, it was. It was a great residency.
Thank you. And if no one else has any questions, and I think that might be a great place to end. So thank you everyone again for joining us today. And thank you so much to Cheryl and Esa for such an engaging conversation and allowing us to go deeper into this beautiful and thoughtful show. Once again, today is the last day to see the show, so please stop by Baxter Street before 6 p.m. Otherwise, Cheryl's viewing room will be on our website after the show is down, so you can revisit the work at any time. And thank you everyone again, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you.